Craig, Carey. Craig, thank you so much for joining. I know that we had a couple kerfuffles to get us to where we are right here in this moment, but I just really trust that this is the right timing. We're live on the right platforms, and I'm grateful for you and your presence today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really appreciate you having me on, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise, Craig. We always have a little practice on our show that actually we're going to be doing live, which I've never done before. So this is a beginning. It's something that I like to do in the green room. It's something where I get aligned. I actually invite my guests to join me or just wait. But it's my practice for just really getting myself centered. It's so easy to move from one thing to the next and just go fast and go quickly, that this little practice, I talk about it in terms of my morning vertical alignment, and it's a whole process. It's a whole practice of really taking time every single morning to move through kind of waking up my body and getting my body up and running in the morning, and then also just tuning into my emotions. How am I feeling? Reminding myself of what's true in terms of my spirit, and then giving myself some growth prompts, and then identifying how I'm going to navigate through the day with that. So that's my A, align, awakening the body. L, listening to my emotions and listening to my soul. I, illuminate the spirit with truth. G, grow, and then N, navigate. So that's my process. But in terms of kind of a real-time moment of getting aligned, I just like to either say a quick prayer or take some deep breaths. And so I'm actually going to do that right here with you. For those joining in, they're welcome to do the same, but it's just going to be about 40 seconds of just closing my eyes. And I welcome you to do that with me, or just wait while I do it, since we didn't have time to do this before. But I'm trusting that this is exactly how it's supposed to be. We could all take a moment to just get aligned, to get centered throughout the day. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to close my eyes and just take a minute. God, I thank you for Craig. God, I thank you for every single person tuning in this morning, this afternoon in London. God, I thank you for how big the world is and how connected we are still. God, I just was reminded of that, how I could just pick up Instagram and call Craig. And it's just such a cool thing. Father, I thank you for the interconnectedness of this world. It's so big, so vast, so beautiful. God, I thank you for this season. This is such a precious time of year. And I ask, Father, that we would hold it with so much just appreciation for everything that has come throughout 2025, Father, that in this moment we would slow down and just recognize how good we really have it. The fact that all of us have access to watch this, to be on the show, man, we have it so good. And I pray that this conversation, God, Craig has so much to give, so much to offer. And I pray that his words would be powerful and impactful, and that we would all walk away better and changed because of this man, in Jesus' name. Amen. Craig, thank you for being here. I'm so excited. I would love for you, as we kind of open up, we were chatting back and forth on LinkedIn, what it is that you really have on your heart. And I would love for you to share with everyone. You said that one of the core things for you has been learning to tell yourself the truth, learning to be honest with yourself. And I think that that is probably one of the most important places to start in terms of just growing and healing and coming to know ourselves. So can you talk a little bit about how you have gone through that yourself? How have you come to be truthful and come to know yourself in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey, really. Because I think I've always kind of thought of honesty as something with other people. Being honest with others. And I think it's something that I've always kind of thought is important, and it's kind of been in there as a value of sorts. But in truth, probably was something that I struggled with, in that sometimes I didn't want to be honest. Sometimes there was things I didn't want to say for various reasons, and so honesty has been a kind of a tricky thing throughout my life anyway. But then getting into the work that I do, and I've been run a personal training business for over 20 years before I got into coaching. so I think the journey started a little bit there, but certainly when I got into coaching, one of the things I really started to notice was how difficult it is sometimes to actually be honest with ourselves. That came up a lot in conversations with clients, and I think through that journey, um, actually working with people, it's been an internal journey for me as well, and it has changed my lens on honesty. It's certainly made me think more about honesty internally and being honest with myself. It's then become a key kind of a core part of the work that I do with my clients, but it's become a real kind of core part of my own personal development over the last few years as well.
I really appreciate you just starting off saying, for the most part, when we think about honesty, we're thinking about it being outward and extending to the external, but it really starts internally. Do we even have that relationship with ourselves? So maybe honesty is actually relational, but we need to have that relational connection with ourselves first. And so, what you said your personal training had a little bit to do with that for the 20-year span that you were running that. How did you, like, what were some practical steps that you went through to learn to be honest with yourself?
I think, obviously when you work with other people, there's some mirroring going on there. You obviously, my work has always, I've kind of always approached my work partly from a kind of a sharing perspective. I've been sharing my passion, my knowledge, my learnings. But it's a two-way thing as well. And obviously sometimes you see things in people that you're working with that you either then recognize in yourself, and I think, the whole truth thing through the kind of the personal training work often came up in, just discussions, and then, maybe even things around, if somebody was trying to work on a certain goal, and then maybe they'd be kind of talking about various excuses or reasons that things hadn't happened, and I could see sometimes that there was this kind of reluctance to actually see and then communicate the truth. So I think that that I started to pick up on that a little bit myself, and obviously, as I grew into my role as a trainer, I got stronger at kind of actually having those discussions with people to help them be honest with themselves. But then, yeah, it just went much deeper once I got into the coaching, because that is a different space again, and I think people were obviously opening up and communicating in ways that they didn't even in the personal training space.
I mean, man, that's a huge reframe of if we want to start to get honest with ourselves and do the internal work first before we can go external. It really a good place to start is, what are other people saying about me? Like, when I look at somebody else and I'm either frustrated by them or I'm watching them grow and change, what's happening in me as a result? You said mirroring. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think we hear that and we think we understand, but I really want to make sure I understand it from even just the executive coaching perspective. When we talk mirroring, what does that really mean, and what's the power there and potential there?
Hmm. I guess what I was speaking to when I brought it up is that if there's one thing that I've learned as a coach, is that we're all far more alike than we are different. We have our differences, obviously, but we're all human beings. And I see so many of, once you start getting down a bit deeper with people, it's the same stuff kind of bubbling away underneath often. So when you actually get to interact with other people in a kind of a deeper way than we often do just conversationally, out with friends, with family, work colleagues, etc., you get to connect to those things, and it helps you see things within yourself, and then obviously you can then communicate from that kind of deeper place, and then that helps them. I mean, when I coach, I share as well. I'm not kind of a coach that just sits there asking questions. If I feel there's something that I can bring that is of value, then I do, and so therefore my coaching feels at times like a mirror, because I feel like, you know, we're speaking to the kind of the same things within each other sometimes.
So good. Man, we're so much more alike than we are not alike. And have you found that there's resistance to that? Because I think that at some level, I know for me, it's easy to feel isolated. It's easy to feel like, man, no one understands. So can you help with that narrative, with that mindset of I'm just in this alone? You know, I remember actually when I was 9 years old, a core narrative formed for me. I was sitting in my bedroom window, and I don't remember exactly what happened leading up to this moment, but I was sitting in my bedroom window looking out, and I was like, all right, it's me and God against the world. And that narrative this is what's dangerous, is when we shape those narratives and then they kind of become true as you get older and you've got more data to prove that being true. Now, the other narrative is true, is that, man, I am so loved. And if I had that narrative at the forefront of my mind, I would have plenty of data to back that too. So, can you talk a little bit about the fact that we're actually way more connected than we really are? And like, why do we have that narrative in the first place that really self isolates us?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, you know, just to kind of firstly say, you know, my own kind of personal journey with it is, you know, I spent a lot of my life, certainly my young life, just thinking that I was different. You know, that I was. I know, you know, I let me first acknowledge that I think, you know, we all are unique. Um, but I think I felt like I was different. I didn't feel like people understood me, even when I'd have conversations with my dad when I was younger. He was great for kind of chats on drives, and you know, he would kind of really listen to problems I had, and he, you know, he had a kind of a great way of, he was very philosophical really, and he the things he said was brilliant. The problem is I kind of felt, yeah, that's great, Dad, but you don't understand me. Like, I'm different. And again, I think I kind of I carried that as a bit of a narrative for a lot of my life, which I guess when you are, you know, when you are carrying that, that is a kind of a disconnect in itself. You know, it's similar to what you were saying. You know, it's me and God against the world. I think, you know, I just there was a disconnect, because I felt like, you know, well, nobody else really gets me, nobody really understands me, therefore I'm different, therefore I think I definitely struggled with a sense of belonging through lots of chapters of my life. And even though I was always in plenty of groups of friends, I was never alone, but I think there was still maybe that kind of loneliness about the kind of the way I saw myself, and you know, that kind of seeing myself as different. And I think, you know, that's changed as I've gone through different chapters of my life, and I think as you get older, your mind changes, and the way you see things can change. Mine certainly has anyway. But I think, again, the coaching has just, I guess it comes back to truth as well. You know, there became too much evidence of the kind
Mm,
of the connectedness of us, and you know, how so many of the things that I had going on inside me and underneath, I started to you know,
mhm.
see was in other people as well.
Yeah.
So I was, yeah, through that I was forced to kind of change my view in a way.
Wow. I really, really love that. I last night I was on the Knowing Show talking about effectively how do we get out of a funk? You know, when we find ourselves really stuck, what are some ways to kind of lift ourselves out, and why do we end up being in a funk in the first place? And one thing was just super practical that I did 2 days ago. You know, I was kind of feeling myself, and there's something about falling down into the funk. You know, David Hawkins talks about assigning numerical value to emotional energies, I guess you could say. So when someone's in shame, they're kind of hunched over, and there's kind of a smaller energy around them, you know, and that level is 50. But then when you get to the level of pride, you're at 150. So you're a little bit bigger and you're a little bit more sure of yourself. But then when you move to the level of courage, it's 200. And now you've got your shoulders back, and you're not motivated by fear, which usually motivates pride, but there's something more about love that's motivating that sense of courage to, I'm going to show up and speak the truth. And there's something about kind of that rising up that is akin to getting yourself out of the funk. And I found that by way of connection with other people, community, we're made for connection. And the more that when we find ourselves kind of falling into this black pit of being in a funk or that negative spirit, I think a lot of times the narratives and stories that accompany that, first we need to pay attention to what those are, but a lot of times it's no one understands, it's self-isolating, it's kind of I have to do this alone, and you kind of almost like turn your back metaphorically to everyone and say, well, you just don't understand, rather than being open and saying, I either need help or let me go help you. And both of those approaches, asking for or offering to give, both receiving and giving is communal. And so I really love that the more you lean into giving to other people, the more you actually receive that sense of community and belonging, and realizing what you struggle with, you're not crazy. They're not crazy. I just think that that's really, really, that's so invaluable, especially as we head into this season, the Christmas season. Can we talk a little bit about that, Craig? Because, I think a lot of times there are other stories, the stories we tell ourselves. What are the stories that you've seen people tell themselves about their family that could actually self-isolate them, that we could rewrite here and now in this conversation?
So let me just get this right. So things that people, like narratives people have around their family that kind of drives them to feel isolated. Is that right?
Yeah, or even push their family away.
Yeah. I think, again, I'm going to kind of come at this from a kind of a personal lens, because I think, I mean, I've always been close to my family, but speaking to what you were saying even before that, I think I've always kind of had this kind of, I don't want to call it a will, maybe it is a will, but to kind of, to be okay on my own, to be able to, I should be able to do this, I should be okay. I shouldn't
Wow.
need any help. I think I've
Mm,
definitely carried that. I've also been reluctant to ask for help because I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to put things on other people. And this has been something that I've seen come up with clients so much, and it's actually, again, it's become a bit of a core kind of part of my work with people, is that actually allowing yourself to be vulnerable basically, as part of it, having the courage to be vulnerable so that you can actually open up. And I talk about, similar to what you were saying there, talk about this channel, and you kind of came at it from kind of giving, but also seeing that actually asking for help is also opens the channel, and is also in a way a giving act, because people who love you want to help you. They want to be a part of your life. They want to be valued. They want to feel needed and feel that they're part of your life. So I see that when you actually ask somebody for help, you open that channel. And I really feel that has, that's had a big impact on me, and I definitely feel that that's had power in the coaching as well.
mm. And frankly, there's danger when we don't ask. I just really appreciate what you're calling out here, Craig, because I think otherwise we can get resentful of those people for maybe they have offered in the past and we said no every time. We train people how to treat us. So if we don't like how someone's treating us, let's use that to mirror and look in the mirror and say, okay, well, what is that showing me about me? And then what's my ideal for this relationship? How do I want it to actually look? We actually need to take responsibility to be the driver in the change by communicating and asking for it. To your point of asking for help, a lot of times that looks like asking for the relationship to be different.
Definitely, I love that, and again, that that's something that I've seen myself. That kind of taking accountability for your role in the relationships in your life, rather than just thinking about how that person is with you, and understanding that, well, you have a role in that, and you've helped
Yes.
create that. I remember in my early 20s, where I was working, there was the manager at the time. I remember him asking me to do something, or it's the way he asked me to do something, and I remember at the time thinking, you wouldn't speak to this other guy who worked there like that. And I remember thinking, why is that? Why does he think it's okay to speak to me like that, but I know he wouldn't speak to the other guy like that? And I that was kind of my first recognition of, well, I must be creating that. Like, I must not have the right boundaries in place, for example, that I've been allowing that to maybe happen. And I think that was my first kind of, it was a bit of an empowering moment where I thought, oh, actually, I'm partly responsible for that.
Man, that is so good. And frankly, it's exciting. Like, as you're talking, I feel excited because now all of a sudden we can take our power back. We don't have to exist in that relationship like that anymore. And that doesn't mean, this is where, Craig, I actually think this is really important, especially as we're heading into so much family time. And instilling a boundary doesn't mean that we're punishing somebody else for the behavior that we've trained them to give us. And I think that's so important. It's not about punishing, it's about retraining and retraining ourselves, because the fact that we're allowing them and teaching them to treat us this way, usually there's a self-worth issue underneath. There's a fear underneath. This whole concept of belonging, if we're afraid we're going to lose that relationship if we put in any kind of healthy boundaries or ask them to treat us better, then that's fear, versus love, and versus, man, I trust this relationship. I trust that you love me, and I think that I kind of deserve better. So, as we seek to put in new boundaries with those we love this Christmas, how should we go about doing that?
I think what you were saying there was really making me think about how these things can be driven by fear, and how often we end up manifesting our fears in the behaviors and actions that we
Yes.
take by trying to avoid them, and disconnection is one of those. With the fear, because that's the kind of deep rooted fear, and maybe we're not even conscious of that, but often that is the fear. The fear is, and again, it speaks to our human need to belong, to be in the tribe. So we have this innate fear around that, and then because of that, like you said, we struggle with being honest. We struggle with setting boundaries because we don't want to disconnect. And yet, by not setting boundaries and by not being honest, we drive the disconnect anyway.
Right. Ah.
So,
oh my gosh, I'm so grateful you said that. We end up manifesting the very thing we're afraid will happen. And isn't that so interesting? It's like what we fixate on. There's this quote that says, where you place your attention is where you place your energy. So if we're placing our attention on the fear, we're actually kind of like putting fuel on the fire of that fear. So it's going to blow up at some point. It's going to happen, versus, okay, let me actually focus my energy and my attention on what is my ideal, what I want, rather than what I'm afraid will happen. So how do we move from focusing on the fear of what could be versus the potential of what we want?
I think I've spoken to you before about kind of two of my pillars of my work, which is honesty and self-compassion, and knitting those two very tightly together. And I think that's, if we can actually shift our focus to that, that will help us drive the right things. And then those two need to be propped up with a bit of courage. And I think you throw those three in, and they're a good anchor. Am I being brave? Am I being honest? Am I being compassionate to myself?
When you talk about compassionate to yourself, what does that mean to you?
Well, in some respects, it's as simple as actually, it's very cliche, but treating yourself. I mean, we think of the phrase as treat others as you would want to be treated yourself, but it's, for a lot of people, actually, you need to kind of twist it around and go, treat yourself as you would treat
Mhm.
others, you know.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's partly that. It's actually, the way you treat yourself, the way you talk to yourself, but also it's just kind of it's taking time to get to know yourself, to understand yourself, um, and to see yourself as a person. We kind
Mhm.
of we live within ourselves, and we kind of then just act out from ourselves. We act outwards with everyone else. But
Yeah.
a lot of our experience is actually internal. Our,
Mm.
our experience of the world is how we feel and what we think, rather than what's actually happening. So even our relationships, a big part of our experience of our relationships is still internal. So we
Mm.
really need to nurture that,
Mm.
um, and actually, so being compassionate with yourself, and seeing yourself as somebody that is worth loving and paying attention to, um,
Yes.
and just bringing it inwards instead of just operating like this all the time. It's like
Mm.
be in here, focus on this, and then radiate out from that.
I love it. I love it. And then to kind of what we were saying earlier, and you said, am I telling the truth? Am I being compassionate? Am I being brave? Those are 3 steps to effectively come to actually do the work of going inward. So to your original, bringing it full circle about being honest and telling the truth. How am I showing up? How am I being perceived? Through how other people are treating me. That's a really, really good way to first get to know ourselves. For those who just feel so disconnected, like I did, 4 years ago when I first started this journey, I had no idea who I was, no idea about emotional intelligence. It was just so foreign. And so, a really good way that I looked in the mirror was considering why my husband left. That's a really hard question. That's a really, really uh, that's a scary one because it's like, what am I going to find asking that? And y'all, each one of us, I think that that's a really good question to ask. Why would you leave you? Why would you actually be done in a relationship? What are we doing now that's kind of the blind spots? And what I realized was I had been living as a non-person. So in one sense, I was like, well, my husband wasn't really married to someone that was vibrant and full of life and present. I was kind of this like phantom in servitude of everyone else. And so over the last few years, as I've really come to do the work to know myself, and thus I can be that much more present, man, my relationships have actually strengthened. So it's actually going to do the result of connection and belonging that we want by first going inward. Because otherwise, you're in relationship with a wisp of wind. You know what I mean? Nothing's there because we're not fully present. So the more we come to know ourselves, the more we do this work of what you're talking about, Greg, the more we actually get to engage in real connection and real relationships, perhaps for the first time. So, to that point of looking in the mirror by way of engaging with other people, what's one more step that you would encourage people? What's a narrative, like as they start seeing themselves in the mirror, to practice self-compassion? What's a narrative that they can put in place that you would say?
I think again it comes down, to use the same words again. One, it's the courage to allow yourself to go inwards, to be vulnerable,
Mm.
and I think a good way of thinking about it is actually, understanding your intentions there. Your intention is to do this, to grow, to move forward, to learn, rather than being focused on the vulnerability, but being focused on the uncomfortableness, rather than being scared about what comes up. Be excited about what you can do with it.
Mm. I love
Be
that.
excited about what you can do with that knowledge. Yes, it may be uncomfortable, but I mean, people cry in my sessions all the time. If I said at the start of the session, do you want to cry today? I can't imagine many people would say yes. But the process of crying is a release. As they release, they think clearer. They bring things to the table. They open up. Once you've done that, then you can work on on going somewhere else and moving to a
Right.
place that you want to be. And it comes to truth. Like, how can you expect to go anywhere you want to go if you don't, if you're not clear on where you are right now? Like, you know, the
Yes.
more you can get clear on who you are, you know, what's going on, how you really feel. I mean, I started journaling a while ago, and I couldn't believe how difficult I found it to answer the simple question, how are you feeling? Because sometimes I didn't want to write it down. I didn't want to admit it.
Yeah.
I didn't want to own it. Certainly didn't want to put it out there. You know, I wanted to move past it, and but you can't really move past things you don't face. You know, all
Right.
you're doing then is you're just covering them up or pushing them down. So I think it's like anything, it's a skill you develop, and you build confidence and courage around it. Because once you start the process of being vulnerable, accepting truth, finding self-compassion, moving forwards,
Mm,
then you it becomes easier to do, you know, because
mm.
you again, I guess it becomes easier to get excited about, you know, what's on the other side of it, you know, instead of just looking at the you know the bit that you don't want to, I don't want to go in there, you know.
Mm. I'm so glad that you said that. Thank you so much. And Craig, it's almost like a self-administered dopamine hit when you focus on where you're going and the progress you're making. There's a book called The Gap and the Gain. The title alone is kind of shares what the purpose is, but the goal is to look from where you started to where you're going rather than, oh, look how much further I have to go. It's like, look how far I've come, and that's my destination, and I'm on my way, and this is so exciting. So I really am so grateful for you joining today. Is there anything else that you would want to add to this conversation that frankly all of us need to do over the next, I think it's 12 days, 13 days until Christmas, 14 days?
I think, you know, this time of year, I feel like there's a lot of people walking around that feel like, you know, they wish that we were a species that could hibernate for a while, because, you know, the days get shorter, it gets
I
dark
know.
and cold. It obviously depend on where you are in the world, but certainly in London, it's cold and dark. You know, people are tired. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of people are dealing with a lot of stress. You know, modern
Mhm.
life is challenging. You know, there's lots of wonderful things about the world that we've created, but there are lots of things about the world we've created.
Yeah.
Therefore, you know, there's lots. We know we're trying to spin all these plates, and it's quite tough. So, you know, I think sometimes it's actually one, recognizing that, you know, some of these things that we think are important are not that important.
Mm.
And actually, you know, just giving yourself a bit of space to write things down. People say this to me all the time, when they actually just get stuff out of their head and write it down. You know, a lot of the time they see it all on the paper and they're like, none of this is important. Why am I so stressed? But
Mm.
other times, what it will help you do is kind of see what is important. So I would definitely, between now and Christmas, try and get some stuff down on paper. Just get that kind of out of your head. But also, I think a really good reframe is recognizing that you have choice. You know, and
Mm.
again, this speaks to truth. A lot of times people will come at me with things, and, oh, but I've got to do this, and you know, and you know, their commitments, so their obligations, various things. And when we really break it down, people start, and there's a lot of friction to this sometimes, because people, they're protected behind that wall that they put up for themselves. You know, well, that wall's there, so there's nothing I can do about it. I don't need to be accountable. You know, whereas when you start to break that wall down, people start feeling a bit vulnerable. But what it does is, like you said earlier, it's empowering. You know, if we put the walls up, okay, you might feel safe, but you're powerless. Whereas there's vulnerability in taking the walls down, but when you take them down, then you're limitless. And I think that, you know, the narratives that we carry can really limit ourselves. And I think if you can look at some of the things in your life, look at some of the things that you say that are imprisoning you, look at the things you say that would um, suggest that you don't have choice, and challenge those things, question the things that you're saying, and find the choice that's there, because There often is choice.
So good. It reminds me of Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning from the camp in Auschwitz. And he said between stimulus and response is choice. You know, whenever anything happens, we always have the opportunity to choose before we respond. And then, you know, out of all the human freedoms that were stripped away from him, the one thing they could not strip away was his freedom to choose his response. And I'm so grateful that you brought that up. So, Craig, thank you so much for joining me, my friend. It was wonderful to meet you and have this conversation. And y'all, thank you so much for joining us on The Knowing Show. I will see you tomorrow.